Hi, Angela. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me. I wanted to start with animal rights. The link between abusing animals and the world's health is clear, but no one in a position of power seems to want to do anything about it. You are yourself a vegan. What's your take on this?
Well, of course, you don't have to be a vegan to be opposed to the systematic abuse of animals, which I think is very much related to the abuse of human animals. The way in which capitalism encourages a prioritization of profit over everything else has had disastrous effects on the production of meat. And of course, all over the world, if one looks at the cattle industry, for example, if one looks at the chicken industry, one sees that the industrialization of food production has led to a situation in which none of those involved actually reflect on what this process looks like from the vantage point of the animals who are raised and then killed. I'm not suggesting that you have to be a vegan in order to have this awareness. In my opinion, it's a question of capitalism. And just as capitalism leads to structural racism that plagues so many institutions and so many individuals, so capitalism leads to forms of production, industrialized production of food that results in systematic violence, systematic abuse. So I think it's a question of helping to encourage a greater and more popular awareness of the damage that global capitalism has done and continues to do to this planet. COVID-19 is a direct consequence of global capitalism, for example.
That's actually my next question. Another thing that COVID-19 has made obvious is that the destruction of nature, intensive farming, mining, as well as the exploitation of wild species have created a perfect storm for the spillover of diseases. Another thing, a recent study in the UK revealed that the fact that there's less pollution in the last 2 months has saved at least 11,000 lives in Europe. So in a way, we know what is wrong, right? But a world where facts would change minds still seems quite far away. How do we explain that?
Well, of course, it's not enough to simply present the facts or present the truth. We know this by now. Ideology consists in creating ways in which people understand and imagine their relationship to the world. And of course, there are those who believe that climate change is non-existent. Of course, I'm talking about, especially about the current occupant of the White House in Washington, and all of those with whom he feels connected. It's not enough to simply represent what is going on. We have to develop strategies that allow us to help people recognize the work that ideology does. And among other things, it prevents us from recognizing the catastrophic transformations that have happened as a direct result of capitalism. How cities are so polluted that it becomes really quite remarkable during these times of COVID-19 to witness, what the city should really look like, what Delhi should look like, Los Angeles. People are, for the very first time, viewing mountains that surround urban areas that have been so polluted as a result of the fact that individual automobiles are prioritized above public transportation. In many ways, you can say, and I'm using the words of Arundhati Roy, that this pandemic can be a portal, and that we shouldn't simply yearn for what existed before the large-scale isolation and shutdown of economies and our social distancing practices. We shouldn't simply look to return to what existed before. We should use this time to reflect on what's possible. And we see that it is possible to inhabit a world without the kind of pollution and climate change that will, of course, ultimately spell the end of life on this planet. We should recognize, for example, that congregate living settings, like particularly those that involve repression, like jails and prisons, that have become cauldrons, for this virus. That these institutions do not have to become a constant aspect of human history. We can abolish them. And of course, now the only solution with respect to jails, prisons, detention centers, and so forth is to release people, because there's no way to social distance. There's no way to engage in the kind of hygienic practices that are encouraged to keep people from being exposed to the virus. Arundhati Roy said that this time can be a portal. And I think that we can reflect on what is possible so that once we emerge from this situation, we're not content with reality as it existed before, but that we move in a direction of a more just and cleaner future.
I was actually reading a couple of days ago, I was reading that 70% of tested inmates in federal prisons in the US have COVID-19. So I know it's a very long answer, but how can we achieve urgently decarceration for the millions of people caged in jails and detention centers in the US and around the world?
Well, that has to be our demand. And I should say that as we speak, there is a demonstration currently happening outside of the gates of San Quentin, a demonstration of automobiles with slogans attached to the exterior of the cars, a demonstration organized by the Labor Action Committee for the Freedom of Mumia Abu Jamal, and largely by members of the Union International Longshore Workers, ILWU, and they are demanding decarceration. We begin by insisting that especially those who are the most vulnerable within the most vulnerable populations, that is to say, populations in jail and prison, should be released. And we're talking about people who are older. And of course, prisons age people much faster than the process occurs in the so-called free world. So we're really talking about people over 50 years old. We're also talking about people who have been in prison for so long that they, like Leonard Peltier, for example, can be among the longest held political prisoners in the country. Leonard Peltier, David Gilbert, Mumia Abu Jamal. But we're also talking about releasing people who shouldn't be in prison. The jails should be emptied. Jails are a place, of course, in the US where people awaiting trial are incarcerated, and those who are convicted of offenses that carry less than a year imprisonment. And so we're demanding that all the jails should be emptied and that prisons should be subject to a process of decarceration. There are 2.3 million people behind bars in this country. You know, even if we reach a point where it is safe to continue without social distancing and without all of the hygienic practices that we've been engaging in over the last 2 months, and the virus is still afflicting people behind bars, then we will never reach the point where we can, actually say we have defeated COVID-19.
I want to give you two numbers. In Georgia, USA, 80% of hospitalized are African Americans. Also, I was reading that between mid-March and early May in New York, 40 people were arrested for social distancing violations. Out of these 40 people, 35 were Afro-Americans. So what does this say about America today?
Well, for a long time, we've been talking about structural racism, the racism that does not necessarily present itself as an aspect of the attitudes of individual people. We've been talking about the fact that racism has been embedded in the major institutions, the major social, economic, political institutions for the entire length of the history of this country, and it's interesting that this is a period this is a historical period that has allowed for the recognition of what we call structural racism. Of course, some of us have been talking about this forever, for decades and decades, but finally, I think, largely as a result of all of the work against police violence, institutionalized police racism that is connected to the Black Lives Matter movement, but also the work that's connected with Palestine. So the idea that racism is embedded in institutions and educational institutions and healthcare institutions and housing in the economy writ large, but especially and perhaps most dramatically in the prison system. What is called mass incarceration is really a consequence of what you might call racial capitalism and the overwhelming disparity, not only of Black people, but also of Latinx people and and indigenous people within jails and prisons in the US. This is what has driven what we call mass incarceration. It's not just mass incarceration, it's mass incarceration inflicted on racialized communities. And so it seems that during this period when people are pointing to the fact that that Black people are disproportionately affected by COVID-19, that there should be some way of putting the two together. Why is it that the jails and prisons are overwhelmingly Black and people of color, and at the same time, the impact on communities of the coronavirus can be seen is much more devastating when it comes to Black communities and Latinx communities and indigenous communities, reservations. What we are witnessing is a consequence of capitalism, of global capitalism. And I'm hoping that the insights that are emerging now stay with us so that we won't claim victory when all of the cities and states are opened up again, but we will see that as a mandate, as a time that in which work is mandated on racism within the healthcare system. And of course, that healthcare system is the healthcare system that has been created by capitalism. As a matter of fact, there never would have been these kinds of shortages and hospital crises had the healthcare system not been almost completely privatized, using, recognizing empty hospital beds as a cause of the declining profitability of the particular hospitals, recognizing shortages of supplies as a result of the just-in-time production policies that are linked to global capitalism. I like what Mike Davis has said, and with respect to this crisis created by the coronavirus. He says that it indicates that in this era of global capitalism, we need a global healthcare system that is not linked to private industry. And I think he's absolutely right where that is concerned.